You are about to discover something that could shake your faith and everything you believe in. What really happened on the cross? Pope Francis, in a surprising revelation, has just questioned the vision that the Church has always taught about the death of Jesus. Imagine for a moment, what if the death of Christ was not as we have been told? His last words, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Xerenia could mean much more than we imagine. Could the Pope be revealing a truth that has been hidden for centuries? This could change the history of Christianity. Get ready, because what you are about to hear will bring doubt, tension, and a lot of curiosity. Before we dive into this shocking revelation, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss any detail of this mystery that could transform everything we know. Your journey to discover the truth begins here. Press play, but first, subscribe. Get ready for a revelation that is shaking the foundations of Christianity and leaving millions of believers in a state of shock. Imagine everything you've always believed, all the truths you've been taught about Jesus Christ's ultimate sacrifice on the cross. Now, what if I told you that a new perspective on this pivotal moment in history is challenging all tradition as we know it? Recently, an unprecedented controversy has swept the religious world. Jesus Christ may not have died on the cross in the way we've been taught to believe. This explosive claim, which many might consider heresy, has caused deep divisions among the faithful and religious leaders. The origins of this commotion stem from a series of speeches by Pope Francis that have stirred up unrest among Catholics around the world. The Pope, known for his progressive views and emphasis on compassion, has brought a new perspective on Christ's death, challenging the traditional view that the crucifixion was a definitive triumph over sin and death. Imagine the weight of these words. Did Jesus, the Son of God, really feel abandoned by God in his final moments? Pope Francis has emphasized in his sermons that Christ's last words on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" do not indicate an immediate victory, but a profound sense of human failure. The Pope's new interpretation has left the faithful in a state of perplexity and doubt. How could the one who redeemed us from our sins have felt defeat in his final moments? For many, this is a perplexing question that opens the door to a heated debate about the true meaning of Jesus' death. Why do these statements have such an impact? Simple. For centuries, the crucifixion has been seen as the final act of redemption, Jesus' victory over evil, the supreme sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins. Millions of Christians around the world celebrate Christ's death as the moment when God demonstrated his ultimate power. But what if this narrative is not as clear as we believe? The tension grows every day as theologians, religious leaders, and scholars try to unravel the implications of this vision proposed by Francis. Many Christians feel deeply divided between their traditional beliefs and the Pope's progressive interpretations. Conservative Catholics accuse the pontiff of heresy, claiming that his words threaten the very foundation of the Christian faith. In contrast, Francis's supporters see his approach as an opportunity to delve deeper into the mysteries of faith, exploring the more human side of Christ's life and challenging us to understand the crucifixion in a new way. But make no mistake, this is not the first time Pope Francis has stirred controversy with his views on faith. Since the beginning of his pontificate, he has raised sensitive issues such as the acceptance of LGBTQ+ relationships and the role of women in the Church. Now, with this reinterpretation of Christ's death, Francis finds himself at the center of one of the greatest religious debates of the modern era. This controversy comes at a crucial time for the Church, which is struggling to adapt to the realities of the contemporary world while trying to preserve its centuries-old traditions. For many, what is at stake is not just a theological question, but the very relevance of the Church in the modern world. Can this radical reinterpretation strengthen the Christian faith and make it more accessible to new generations? Or does it risk alienating more traditional believers rooted in ancient beliefs? In a Vatican traditionally known for its conservatism, one man is causing a true revolution. Pope Francis, the 266th pontiff of the Catholic Church, is the embodiment of a new kind of leadership, compassionate, inclusive, and above all, progressive. Since his election in 2013, Francis has challenged centuries of conservative dogma and beliefs, moving the Church in a direction that many consider bold, risky, and at the same time, deeply necessary. From the beginning of his papacy, Francis made it clear that he would not be just another pope. His early decisions already signaled a new kind of leader. He chose not to live in the luxurious papal apartments of the Apostolic Palace, preferring the modest Casa Santa Marta. This simple choice was a powerful signal that the Pope was not interested in ostentation, but rather in living in close proximity to the people, especially those most in need. But Francis's actions do not stop there. He has positioned himself as a defender of the marginalized, the forgotten, those who are often ignored by society and even by the Church itself. His emphasis on compassion, forgiveness, and inclusion has become a hallmark of his pontificate. For the Pope, the Church should be a field hospital, welcoming everyone, regardless of their social status, background, or religion. Imagine the tension within the Church. Many conservative leaders, accustomed to a rigid and exclusive approach, were perplexed by Pope Francis's words and actions. How can we accept that a man with so much power would decide to focus on issues such as the inclusion of minorities, the acceptance of LGBTQ+ believers, and the welcoming of divorced and remarried people into the Church? For Pope Francis, compassion is the heart of the Christian faith, and he has shown this in surprising ways. One of the most notable examples is his attitude toward LGBTQ+ people. During an informal conversation, the Pope made one of the most talked about statements of his pontificate: "Who am I to judge?" These words, spoken in response to a question about homosexuals in the Church, echoed around the world, signaling that Francis was willing to challenge entrenched attitudes and create a more inclusive space within Catholicism. Another example is his stance on the divorced and remarried. Historically, the Catholic Church has denied these believers the right to receive the sacraments, but Francis, with his compassionate heart, has argued that everyone has the right to approach God, regardless of their past mistakes. This approach has generated enormous controversy among more traditional Catholics who see it as a dilution of the faith. But for the Pope's supporters, this openness reflects the true spirit of Jesus Christ, who never turned his back on sinners. In 2016, during the Holy Year of Mercy, Francis took an even bolder step. He declared that all priests could grant forgiveness to women who had committed abortion, a sin considered extremely serious by the Catholic Church. For many, this was a revolutionary action, signaling a new era of mercy within the Church. The Pope, without denying the gravity of abortion, chose to focus on forgiveness and healing rather than continuing to marginalize women who have gone through this difficult decision. For some conservative Catholics, this went too far. They argue that Francis is diluting traditional doctrines and weakening the authority of the Church. But for others, his actions are a clear manifestation of God's love, a love that knows no boundaries and is always ready to forgive. Another theme that has defined Francis's papacy is his views on the environment. He has become one of the most vocal advocates for the protection of the earth, our common home, as he described it in his encyclical Laudato Si. For the Pope, environmental destruction is not just a political or economic issue. It is a spiritual issue. He has called on humanity to rethink its relationship with nature, emphasizing that the poorest are the most affected by environmental degradation. For Francis, caring for the environment is part of our responsibility as Christians. This stance has put him on a collision course with conservative politicians and business leaders who deny climate change or refuse to adopt more sustainable measures. But Francis is undeterred. He continues to preach passionately about the urgent need to change our relationship with the natural world, emphasizing that this is a moral issue, not just an economic one. Francis's progressive views, however, have come at a price. He has faced severe criticism, not only from conservative sectors of the Church, but also from politicians and religious leaders around the world. Many accuse him of abandoning the Church's traditional teachings in favor of a liberal agenda. Conservative Catholic groups have even suggested that the Pope is guilty of heresy, claiming that he is leading the Church away from its roots. Despite the criticism, Francis remains steadfast in his mission. He believes that the Church must be a place of welcome, love, and forgiveness. For him, the greatest challenge of our time is to find ways to bring the values of the gospel to the modern world without losing the essence of the Christian faith. The big question is, what does the future hold for the Catholic Church under Francis' leadership? Are we witnessing the dawn of a new era, where compassion and inclusiveness prevail over rigid tradition? Or will divisions within the Church deepen as conservatives resist change? A wave of perplexity is sweeping the Catholic and Christian world. The leader of more than 1 billion faithful, Pope Francis, has been making statements that shake the foundations of traditional faith. The death of Jesus Christ, one of the pillars of Christianity, is being reinterpreted by the pontiff in ways that many consider revolutionary and even scandalous. In a series of moving and courageous speeches, Pope Francis has suggested that Jesus' life ended in human failure, challenging the established view of his sacrifice on the cross. For many Christians around the world, Jesus' crucifixion represents the ultimate victory over sin and death, an act of sacrifice that brought redemption to humanity. However, Pope Francis' statements about Christ's death are raising profound and challenging questions. Did Jesus really win on the cross as we have believed for centuries? Or was his death a moment of human despair, a failure that was only later understood as part of the divine plan? In his recent speeches, Pope Francis has highlighted one of Jesus' most striking and enigmatic phrases on the cross. my God, why have you forsaken me?" For many, these words have always carried the weight of a moment of despair, but they have been explained within Christian theology as part of the plan of redemption. Francis, however, suggests that we may be missing the real essence of this moment. According to the Pope, these words may reflect Jesus' human failure, a sense of abandonment that contradicts the image of the triumphant Christ that tradition has taught us. Francis argues that from a purely human perspective, Jesus' life ended in defeat. He was abandoned by his disciples, betrayed, condemned to death by the religious leaders of his day, and finally crucified by the Romans. How can this be seen as a victory? The impact of these words is profound. How can we accept that the Son of God himself felt abandoned and, apparently, defeated? This question has caused discomfort in many sectors of the Church and among the faithful, who grew up believing in the traditional view of Christ's victorious sacrifice. But Francis goes further. He is not denying the resurrection or the power of salvation, but he is calling us to reflect on the human aspect of Jesus' life and death, a side that we often ignore. Reactions to Francis' statements have been varied and intense. Many faithful, especially those of more conservative leanings, were shocked by the idea that the Pope might be suggesting a reinterpretation of Christ's death, one of the central truths of Christianity. For these Catholics, the crucifixion has always been seen as the perfect sacrifice, the act that brought the final victory over sin and death. How can Pope Francis suggest that Jesus failed? Some ask. These words have caused distress among those who hold to a more traditional view of the faith, who see the Pope's statements as a threat to the doctrinal stability of the Church. Accusations of heresy have not been long in coming, and some of Francis's most vehement critics have even called for his resignation. On the other hand, many believe that Francis is bringing new depth to the faith. For these believers, the Pope's vision does not diminish the significance of Christ's death, but invites us to understand the true cost of Jesus' sacrifice. Francis asks us to consider the human side of the story, where Jesus in his final moments felt the weight of failure, abandonment, and pain, feelings that any human being can deeply understand. For these supporters, the Pope is opening new doors to understanding divine compassion and forgiveness in a more intimate and real way. Jesus lived the human experience in all its depths, and that includes despair and a sense of failure. Francis is not diminishing Christ's saving role. He is in fact showing us how Jesus' humanity is essential to understanding the immense sacrifice he made for us. For Pope Francis, the true power of Jesus' death lies in the resurrection. He argues that although Christ's life ended in apparent human failure, God transformed that failure into victory through the resurrection. This, Francis says, does not negate the suffering and despair of Jesus on the cross, but it helps us understand that God works in unexpected and mysterious ways, bringing life and hope where there seemed only defeat. This insight has the potential to bring more people closer to faith, especially those who, in difficult times, feel abandoned or defeated. Francis is saying Jesus felt this way too. He wants us to understand that even the Son of God went through moments of darkness, and that there is no shame in feeling defeated, because the ultimate victory belongs to God. Since assuming the papacy in 2013, Francis has been a leader who is not afraid to ask difficult questions and challenge long-held assumptions. He has brought a series of changes and new perspectives to the Catholic Church, addressing issues ranging from acceptance of minorities to protecting the environment. These new interpretations of Christ's death are just one more facet of his mission to make the Christian faith more accessible and relevant to the modern world. Francis is, above all, a pope of compassion. He understands that the world is constantly changing and that the Church must find ways to remain true to its beliefs while adapting to the new realities of society. His statements about the death of Jesus are a perfect example of how he is trying to balance tradition with modernity, asking the faithful to reflect deeply on the true meaning of faith in a world that often seems adrift. Francis has brought a new energy to the papacy, choosing not to wear the opulent symbols of power associated with his position, such as the gold-embroidered robe or the papal throne. For him, true power lies in service, a vision that has stayed with him since his days as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, when he was known for taking buses instead of official cars and cooking his own meals. This leadership style, focused on simplicity and accessibility, has been a breath of fresh air for many of the faithful who longed for a pope who was closer to everyday reality. A central feature of Francis's leadership is his tireless dedication to the poor, marginalized and forgotten in society. From the beginning of his papacy, he has emphasized that the Church must be a field hospital, always ready to welcome and heal those who have been cast aside by society. Francis has a vision of a Church that is not exclusive but inclusive. He cares deeply about refugees, immigrants, the homeless, and all those suffering on the world's peripheries. In one of his most moving moments, he washed the feet of refugees, including Muslims, in a clear message that compassion and humanity transcend religious boundaries. However, his emphasis on the marginalized goes beyond symbolic gestures. Francis has challenged the Church to take concrete action on social and environmental issues, calling for the creation of fairer economic systems and criticizing unbridled capitalism, which he says contributes to inequality and global poverty. In his encyclical Laudato Si, the Pope stressed the need to care for our common home, planet Earth, and warned of the devastating effects of climate change, especially on the poorest. Despite his charisma and popularity, Francis's reforms and progressive stances have provoked strong resistance among conservative sectors of the Church. Many traditionalists say the Pope is taking the Church down a dangerous path, diluting doctrines and endangering what they consider to be the core values of Catholicism. Among the issues that have generated the most controversy are Francis's attitudes toward LGBTQ+ people, divorce and remarriage, and women in the Church. Unlike his predecessors, Francis has shown himself open to discussing topics that have long been taboo in the Church. His famous phrase, "Who am I to judge?" in reference to homosexual people, caused a real earthquake within the Catholic community. For some, it was a long-awaited gesture of inclusion. For others, it was seen as a sign of weakness and a concession to modern times. In addition, his willingness to allow priests to offer forgiveness to women who have had abortions and his openness to the debate on communion for divorced and remarried people have also generated criticism. Conservatives accuse the Pope of weakening the Church's doctrines, and some groups have even called him a heretic. Tensions within the Church are evident, with more traditional voices calling for a return to orthodoxy, while Francis continues to challenge established boundaries. Francis, however, remains firm in his convictions. He believes that the Church must evolve to remain relevant in the modern world. For him, the Catholic faith cannot be a set of inflexible rules. It must be living, practical, and compassionate. His goal is to build a church that welcomes everyone, not one that excludes those who do not fit into the traditional mold. This clash has intensified since the election of Pope Francis, who has brought a new vision to the papacy, marked by an emphasis on social issues, compassion, inclusion, and a more open approach to topics that have long been considered taboo in the Church. From the beginning of his pontificate, Francis has been seen as a symbol of progressivism, someone willing to confront sensitive issues with courage and a deep understanding of the complexities of the modern world. But this progressive movement has also generated resistance, causing divisions within the Church, with more conservative sectors feeling threatened by the changes. The tension between these two visions is shaping the future of the Catholic Church and raising fundamental questions about what it means to be faithful to its roots while responding to contemporary challenges. For progressives, the Church cannot afford to remain stagnant in a world that is constantly changing. Issues such as gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, social and environmental justice, and the need for greater inclusion of the faithful who find themselves on the margins of society have risen to the forefront of the Church's agenda under Francis. One of the most debated and perhaps most controversial topics has been the Pope's stance on LGBTQ+ people. Francis has stated that the Church must welcome all people regardless of their sexual orientation, even allowing priests to bless same-sex couples in some cases. His words, "Who am I to judge?" uttered in response to a question about homosexuals, echoed around the world as a clear sign that this Pope is willing to break down barriers and reimagine the Church as a space of inclusion, not exclusion. In addition, Francis has made significant gestures of openness toward the divorced and remarried, a group that has traditionally been excluded from receiving the sacraments of the Church. For him, God's mercy is infinite, and the Church must reflect this compassion in its practice. These gestures of welcome are seen by progressives as a step towards a Church that is closer to the problems and realities of people. Another point that puts progressivism in the spotlight is the Church's stance on environmental issues. Pope Francis has positioned himself as one of the greatest advocates of the fight against climate change and the protection of those most vulnerable to the impacts of environmental degradation. In his encyclical, Laudato Si, he highlighted the need for an integral ecology, where the protection of nature is intrinsically linked to human dignity and social justice. For Francis, there is no separation between faith and social action. However, for many conservatives and traditionalists, these changes are threatening the essence and purity of the Catholic faith. They believe that the Catholic Church is built on solid and eternal foundations, and to tamper with these doctrines would be to undermine the faith itself. Truth, in the view of traditionalists, cannot be molded or adapted to the whims of social change, but must remain unchanged, as taught by Christ, and defended by the great saints and doctors of the Church throughout the centuries. Conservatives express deep concern that in trying to adapt to the modern world, the Church is diluting its doctrines and will eventually lose its identity. To them, the acceptance of same-sex couples, the permission of divorced and remarried people to receive the sacraments, and even the more lenient stances on abortion represent an erosion of the core tenets of the Catholic faith. The fear that progressivism could lead the Church down a path of relativism is palpable. For traditionalists, the Church must be a beacon of truth, unchanging and unshakable, even as the world around it changes. They believe that the role of the Church is not to adapt to modern trends, but to be a spiritual anchor in times of confusion, offering clear and definitive answers. Among the clearest examples of conservative opposition is the criticism of communion for the divorced and remarried. According to traditionalists, allowing such people to receive the sacraments is a direct violation of Christ's teachings on marriage. Likewise, the acceptance of LGBTQ+ people is seen as a concession to a culture that, according to them, goes against the moral principles of the Church. At stake in this debate is the future of the Catholic Church itself. On the one hand, there are those who believe that the Church must evolve to remain relevant in an ever-changing world. For them, Adapting doctrines to new social and cultural realities is a way to keep the faith alive and accessible to all people. The Church should not be a rigid and dogmatic institution, but rather a space of welcome, compassion, and inclusion. Pope Francis, from the beginning of his papacy, has shown himself to be a leader who dares to confront old taboos and open new doors, always with an approach of compassion, inclusion, and mercy. However, these same reforms that seek to make the Church more welcoming to those who have traditionally been marginalized have also generated deep divisions within the institution. Among the most discussed reforms is the decision to allow priests to bless same-sex couples, something unimaginable just a few years ago within the Catholic Church. This move by Francis represents a radical change in the way the Church deals with issues of sexuality. Traditionally, the Vatican's official position has been that same-sex relationships are intrinsically disordered, and any form of recognition or blessing is strictly forbidden. However, the Pope, with his emphasis on compassion and inclusion, has taken a bold step in suggesting that it is not about judging people, but rather welcoming them into their journey of faith. His famous phrase, "Who am I to judge?" has resounded around the world as an echo of hope for millions of LGBTQ+ believers who have long felt excluded from the Church. For supporters of Francis' reforms, this is a matter of justice and mercy. They argue that the Church should be a place of welcome, and that love between two people, regardless of their sexual orientation, should not be denied or marginalized. For these believers, Pope Francis's reforms are bringing the Church into the 21st century, creating a space where everyone can encounter God's love, regardless of their sexual identity. But critics say the change represents a dangerous departure from the core doctrines of the faith. Many traditionalists argue that by allowing the blessing of same-sex couples, the Pope is setting precedents that threaten the moral integrity of the Church. For these critics, the teaching on the sanctity of marriage between a man and a woman is fundamental and immutable. They fear that this change could weaken the family structure and dilute Catholic teaching on marriage. Another significant reform that has generated intense controversy is the decision to allow priests to grant forgiveness to women who have had abortions. Abortion has always been considered a very serious sin by the Catholic Church, punishable by excommunication. For a long time, only bishops or the Pope himself could grant forgiveness to those who committed such an act. Francis, however, has introduced a new vision of forgiveness and mercy. He understands that abortion is a painful issue for many women, and that they often find themselves in desperate situations. During the Holy Year of Mercy, the Pope announced that all priests would be allowed to grant forgiveness to women who have had abortions, arguing that compassion should be above all judgment. He called for the Church to be a place of healing, not condemnation. For supporters of this reform, the Pope is reflecting the true spirit of Christianity. They believe that by offering forgiveness, Francis is showing the true heart of God, who is always merciful and willing to forgive. The decision to forgive women who have had abortions does not diminish the gravity of the act, but rather provides an opportunity for healing and reconciliation. On the other hand, critics see this reform as a dangerous relaxation of Catholic morality. They argue that by making it easier to forgive abortion, the Pope is somehow minimizing the gravity of this sin. Many traditionalists believe that the Church's stance on abortion should remain uncompromising, as a testament to the sanctity of life from conception. They fear that this merciful approach could weaken the Church's opposition to abortion and send a mixed message about its pro-life stance. These reforms, among many others, have sparked heated debate within the Catholic Church. On the one hand, there are those who see Francis as a courageous leader who is bringing the Church closer to the teachings of Jesus by focusing on love, forgiveness, and inclusion. These believers argue that the Church must evolve to remain relevant in an ever-changing world. For them, the Pope is simply applying the message of mercy that Jesus taught. Welcoming those who have long felt alienated from the faith, Francis sees a world dominated by greed, where the obsession with material goods, power, and wealth destroys solidarity between peoples and distances people from God. In one of his most influential encyclicals, Laudato Si', he addresses the connections between capitalism, environmental destruction, and social exclusion, calling on humanity to rethink its economic model in the name of social justice and sustainability.